I am Abigail Morrison, 28 years old, and I have always been the black sheep of my wealthy family. When I walked into that prestigious Boston law office for my grandfather Harold's will reading, I could feel the judgmental stares burning through my simple black dress. My mother Diana whispered to my father Richard, thinking I couldn't hear, "Why did she even bother coming?" My brother Maxwell smirked. They had no idea that within an hour, their perfectly curated world would completely shatter. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever felt like the outsider in your own family. Trust me, what happened next is something you will not want to miss. Growing up as a Morrison meant something in Boston's social circles. Our family name adorned buildings, charities, and was whispered with reverence in country clubs across New England. But being a Morrison also meant living under the crushing weight of expectations that I never seemed able to satisfy. My earliest memories revolve around my grandfather Harold's estate, a sprawling property with gardens where he would take me for walks every Sunday. While my parents were busy grooming my brother Max to take over the family empire, Grandpa Harold and I would spend hours talking about art, philosophy, and my dreams. "You have a different kind of brilliance, Abby," he would say, his weathered hand patting mine. "Not everyone will understand it, but that doesn't make it any less valuable." The Morrison fortune began with my grandfather's innovative shipping logistics company in the 1960s. Through strategic expansions and investments, Harold Morrison built an empire worth billions. My father Richard, his only son, joined the business straight out of Harvard Business School, eager to prove himself worthy of the Morrison legacy. My mother Diana, from the equally prestigious Blackwell family, was the perfect corporate wife, poised, strategic, and ruthlessly status-conscious. Together, they crafted the ideal family image with one glaring imperfection: me. From childhood, Max excelled at everything our parents valued: sports, business acumen, networking. He had my father's commanding presence and my mother's social intelligence. I, on the other hand, was quiet, artistic, and uncomfortable with the superficial relationships that dominated our social circle. "Abigail, stand up straight," my mother would hiss at charity galas. "And for heaven's sake, try to say something impressive to the Vandermeer boy." When I won a state art competition at 13, my mother smiled tightly and said, "That's nice, dear. But let's not mention it at dinner tonight. The Hamiltons are coming, and their daughter just got accepted to Phillips Exeter." My father was less subtle. When I expressed interest in studying psychology instead of business, he laughed outright. "Psychology? What good is understanding people's problems if you can't monetize the solution?" This family didn't get where it is by holding hands and talking about feelings. Only Grandpa Harold celebrated my differences. When I graduated high school, he gifted me a set of professional art supplies with a note that I still keep in my wallet: "Create beauty in a world that often forgets to look for it." Despite my parents' disapproval, I pursued a degree in social work at Boston University instead of attending my father's alma mater. The day I announced my career choice at a family dinner remains seared in my memory. "A social worker," my mother had exclaimed, setting down her wine glass with enough force to splash the expensive Bordeaux. "Do you have any idea how that reflects on this family? People will think we've failed somehow." My father didn't even look up from his steak. "If you pursue this ridiculous path, don't expect any financial support from us." Only Max seemed amused. "Come on, sis. You can't be serious. You're a Morrison. Morrisons don't work for $40,000 a year helping drug addicts and welfare cases." I moved out that night, taking only what I had purchased myself and a few gifts from my grandfather. I found a small apartment with a roommate and worked part-time jobs while finishing my degree. True to his word, my father cut me off completely. Except for mandatory holiday appearances where I endured subtle and not-so-subtle jabs about my life choices, I limited contact with my immediate family. The exception was Grandpa Harold, who would meet me for lunch every month, genuinely interested in my studies and later, my cases at the community center where I worked. "You're doing important work, Abby," he would say. "Don't let anyone tell you different." When I received the call about his passing, I was meeting with a teenage client who had finally agreed to enter a substance abuse program. I finished the meeting, made the arrangements, and then sat in my car and sobbed for an hour. I had lost the only person in my family who truly saw me. The Morrison family mausoleum stands on a hill overlooking the city, a testament to generations of wealth and influence. The day of Grandpa Harold's funeral was unseasonably cold for May, with gray clouds hanging low over the cemetery. It felt appropriate somehow, as if even the weather recognized the loss of warmth in the world. I arrived early, wanting a moment alone before facing the family. The funeral home had already arranged everything perfectly: masses of white lilies and blue hydrangeas, Harold's favorites, surrounded his mahogany casket. I placed a single yellow rose among them, the kind we would find on our Sunday walks. A rather pedestrian addition, don't you think? My mother's voice cut through my reverie. She stood behind me in an impeccably tailored black Chanel suit, not a hair out of place despite the humidity. Yellow roses were his favorite, I said simply. She sniffed. I wouldn't expect you to understand the proper etiquette for someone of your grandfather's stature. People began arriving in streams: business associates, politicians, socialites, all dressed in designer morning wear and exchanging air kisses and subdued pleasantries. I recognized faces from childhood events. People who had watched me grow up but now regarded me with vague confusion, as if trying to place how the shabby Morrison relation fit into the family portrait. Abigail, darling, it's been ages. My Aunt Margaret approached, her eyes scanning my simple black dress that I'd purchased on sale at Nordstrom Rack. Are you still doing that volunteer work? I'm a licensed clinical social worker at East Boston Community Center, I replied. And it's not volunteer work, it's my career. How fulfilling for you, she said with the same tone one might use to describe cleaning toilets. Your cousin Stephanie just made junior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. Only 32, isn't that impressive? The service itself was a parade of carefully crafted eulogies from business partners and community leaders, all speaking about Harold Morrison, the titan of industry, the philanthropist, the visionary. None mentioned how he could name every bird that visited his garden, or how he still wrote love poems to my grandmother 30 years after her death. None mentioned the man I knew. My father delivered a speech about legacy and responsibility that sounded more like a corporate annual report than a tribute to his father. Max stood beside him. The picture of the grieving grandson in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I wasn't asked to speak. After the burial, everyone gathered at my parents' estate for the reception. I overheard snippets of conversation as I navigated the periphery of the crowd, invisible as usual. Harold's stake in the company must be worth billions now. Richard will likely take over as chairman. I heard the summer house in Martha's Vineyard alone is valued at $12 million. I found a quiet corner with a plate of untouched food, when a tall, distinguished man with silver hair approached me. Miss Abigail, he said warmly, extending his hand. Franklin Pierce. I was your grandfather's attorney for over 30 years. Yes, Mr. Pierce. I remember you from Christmas parties when I was younger. His eyes crinkled kindly. Your grandfather spoke of you often and with great pride. Before I could respond, my brother appeared at Franklin's elbow, clapping him on the shoulder with forced camaraderie. Frank. Just the man I wanted to see. Max glanced at me dismissively. Mind if I steal him, sis? We have actual business to discuss. Franklin's expression remained neutral, but he firmly stood his ground. Actually, Maxwell, I was having a conversation with your sister. Perhaps we can speak later. Max's smile tightened. Sure. Just wanted to run some ideas by you for the company expansion once everything's settled. I've got some innovative plans I'm sure my grandfather would have approved of. After he left, Franklin turned back to me. Your grandfather was concerned about some of your brother's innovative plans, he said quietly. Perhaps we could meet for coffee this week? There are matters we should discuss before the will reading. Before I could reply, my mother materialized beside us. Social radar perfectly attuned to any interaction that might threaten the family hierarchy. Franklin, the Whitmores are looking for you, she said smoothly, positioning herself between us. Something about that hospital wing donation Harold promised. As Franklin excused himself with a meaningful glance in my direction, my mother turned to me. "I hope you're not expecting anything significant from the will reading," she said, voice low. "Your grandfather was disappointed by your choices. Whatever front he put on during your little lunch dates." "I'm not expecting anything," I replied truthfully. And Grandpa Harold wasn't the kind of person who measured love in dollar signs. "How convenient for someone who turned her back on family obligations," she snapped. "This empire wasn't built by people following their passion or whatever self-indulgent philosophy you subscribe to." The notification came via formal letter 3 days after the funeral. The reading of Harold Morrison's last will and testament would take place the following Tuesday at the offices of Pierce, Goldstein, and Winthrop. As I placed the heavy cream stationery on my kitchen counter, I felt a strange mixture of dread and finality. The last official act of being Harold Morrison's granddaughter was about to play out. The Pierce, Goldstein, and Winthrop building stood like a monument to old money in downtown Boston, all polished granite and gleaming brass fixtures. I paused on the sidewalk, watching my relatives arrive in luxury vehicles, each making a more impressive entrance than the last. My cousin Stephanie and Bradley stepped from a chauffeured Bentley, while Aunt Margaret and Uncle George arrived in his signature vintage Jaguar. I smoothed down my most professional outfit, a navy pantsuit I'd splurged on for client court appearances, and tried to quiet the anxiety churning in my stomach. This wasn't about money. I had made peace with my financial situation years ago. This was about saying a final goodbye to the person who had truly loved me in this family. The security guard checked my ID with visible surprise, as if someone with the Morrison name shouldn't arrive on foot without an entourage. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt interminable. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a reception area that screamed old-world luxury, oriental rugs over marble floors, oil paintings of stern-looking founding partners, and furniture that had probably witnessed a century of wealth-changing hands. "Miss Morrison," a poised receptionist approached. "The reading will take place in the Heritage Room. Your family has already arrived." I followed her down a hallway, my sensible heels sinking into plush carpeting. Through the partially open door, I could hear the murmur of family voices, the distinct tinkling of my mother's practiced laugh. What I didn't expect to see when I entered were the cameras. 2 professional video setups stood at opposite corners of the massive conference room, their operators making final adjustments to equipment. "What's all this?" I heard my father demand as I slipped into the room. Franklin Pierce stood at the head of a gleaming mahogany table. "Mr. Morrison, your father specifically requested that today's proceedings be recorded. All participants were notified of this requirement in the meeting details." My father frowned, but said nothing further. No one acknowledged my entrance except for my cousin Bradley, who gave me a slight nod before returning to his whispered conversation with Stephanie. The seating arrangement told its own story of family hierarchy. My father sat at one end of the table, my mother and Max flanking him. The rest of the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, filled the remaining leather chairs based on perceived importance. No seat had been left for me. I quietly took one of the visitor chairs positioned against the wall. Designed for accountants or assistants, not primary family members. "She's not even family anymore," my mother whispered to my father, loudly enough that her voice carried in the hushed room. "I don't know why she bothered to come." Several relatives glanced in my direction with barely concealed smirks. My cousin Stephanie leaned toward her husband. "I heard she lives in a studio apartment in East Boston. Can you imagine a Morrison in that neighborhood?" Max laughed. "Maybe she's hoping for enough to cover her student loans. Social work degrees don't exactly pay for themselves." "I still can't believe Harold indulged her little rebellion all these years," Aunt Margaret added. "Those monthly lunches just encouraged her defiance." I kept my eyes fixed on my hands folded in my lap, the familiar sting of their contempt washing over me. I had expected this. Prepared for it even, but it still hurt. In their eyes, I was a failure, a disappointment, a cautionary tale told to the younger generation about straying from the Morrison path. Franklin cleared his throat as his associates distributed leather portfolios to each person at the table. I was surprised when one was handed to me as well. As we prepare to begin, I want to thank everyone for being here today, Franklin said formally. Harold Morrison was not only my client, but a dear friend for over 3 decades. He put considerable thought into the distribution of his estate. My father straightened his tie impatiently. We appreciate the sentiment, Franklin, but we all have businesses to return to. Perhaps we could proceed with the relevant distributions. Franklin's expression remained professional, but something flashed in his eyes. Of course, Richard. However, I should inform everyone that there will be some unexpected elements to today's proceedings. Harold was very specific about how he wanted his final wishes communicated. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. A collective intake of breath, a rustle of nervous adjustment. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt all eyes turned toward me, calculating, reassessing. Even my father looked momentarily uncertain. Well then, my mother said with forced brightness, let's get started, shall we? Franklin opened a leather-bound document and began the formal reading. The cameras recorded silently from their corners, their presence adding an unexpected weight to the proceedings. I, Harold Edward Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. The initial bequests were standard and expected. Longtime household staff received generous sums. Charitable donations were made to the hospital where my grandmother had been treated, the university that had helped launch Grandpa's career, and several arts organizations. To my sister, Eleanor Morrison Wells, I leave my collection of first edition books and the sum of $5 million. Aunt Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. To my brother, William Morrison, I leave my vintage automobile collection and the sum of $5 million. Uncle William nodded solemnly, though everyone knew he had been expecting significantly more. As Franklin continued through cousins, nieces, and nephews, each receiving specific items of sentimental value and modest financial gifts by Morrison standards, a palpable tension began building around the table. The major assets, the company's shares, the real estate holdings, the bulk of the financial portfolio, remained unmentioned. My father checked his watch repeatedly. My mother's perfectly manicured nails tapped an impatient rhythm on the table. Max's confident smirk had faded to a puzzled frown. For the remaining assets, Franklin finally said, Harold has prepared a video message. He nodded to his assistant, who dimmed the lights and activated a projection screen that descended from the ceiling. After a moment of technical adjustment, my grandfather's face appeared, so lifelike and present that my breath caught in my throat. Harold Morrison looked directly into the camera from what I recognized as his library. Though his illness had clearly taken a toll, his blue eyes, the same shade as mine, remained sharp and clear. If you're watching this, he began, his voice steady, then I've moved on to whatever adventure comes next. First, I want to thank Franklin for ensuring my wishes are carried out exactly as instructed. My grandfather smiled slightly, the familiar crinkles appearing around his eyes. I've lived a fortunate life by any measure. I built a successful business, loved a wonderful woman for 42 years, raised a family, and watched it grow. But with success comes perspective. And I've observed with increasing concern how wealth has affected those I care about most. My father shifted uncomfortably. My mother's tapping stopped. When you build something from nothing, as I did, you understand the value of work, of struggle, of earning your place. I fear that in providing abundance for my family, I may have inadvertently robbed some of you of the opportunity to develop your own strength of character. Grandpa Harold leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. I've watched as the Morrison name became more important than Morrison values. I've seen the pursuit of status eclipse the pursuit of purpose. Most distressingly, I've witnessed how those who choose a different path have been treated by this family. My heart pounded as several heads turned subtly in my direction. Money is a tool, not a measure of worth. Position is an opportunity, not an entitlement. The Morrison legacy should be one of integrity, innovation, and compassion, not merely wealth and social standing. My grandfather paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. With that in mind, I have made decisions about my estate that some of you may find surprising. These decisions were not made lightly, nor out of any desire to punish. Rather, they represent my best judgment about what will ultimately benefit both individuals and the legacy I hope to leave. He smiled then, warm and familiar. There is one person who has consistently demonstrated the values I most respect: independence, courage, compassion, and genuine concern for others. One person who chose purpose over privilege, substance over status. One person who, despite being repeatedly criticized and marginalized by her own family, remained true to her convictions. The room had gone completely still. I could feel the weight of every gaze turning toward me. "Abigail," my grandfather said, as if speaking directly to me, "you have made me prouder than you can possibly know. Your work changes lives. Your integrity has never wavered, even when it would have been easier to conform. You are the embodiment of the best of the Morrison spirit, though ironically. You're the only one who never felt the need to remind people of your last name." Tears streamed down my face as I watched the only person who had truly accepted me deliver his final message. Therefore, to my granddaughter Abigail Claire Morrison, I leave controlling interest in Morrison Enterprises, comprising 51% of voting shares. Additionally, I leave her my primary residence and its contents, my personal investment portfolio, and the remainder of my liquid assets not otherwise designated in this will. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by my mother's audible gasp. "Franklin Pierce will serve as advisor and co-trustee until Abigail feels prepared to assume full control. Franklin has been briefed on my reasoning and has my complete confidence in this transition." My grandfather's expression softened. "Abigail, I know this responsibility comes as a shock, and that you never sought this role. But I have watched you carefully over the years. Your compassion does not mean you lack strength. Your humility does not mean you lack vision. You may not have studied business, but you understand people, and ultimately, all business is about people." The video continued, but I barely registered the words through my shock. I was vaguely aware of Franklin pausing the recording and approaching me. "Ms. Morrison," he said formally, "would you please take the chair at the head of the table?" The seconds after Franklin's request stretched into an eternity of suspended reality. My legs felt leaden as I rose from my peripheral seat and moved toward the imposing chair at the head of the table, my grandfather's position, then my father's presumed inheritance, now apparently mine. The expressions around the table transformed in waves: shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally, for most, barely contained fury. My father was the first to break the stunned silence, his face flushing to a dangerous shade of crimson. "This is preposterous," he thundered, slamming his fist on the mahogany. My father was clearly not in his right mind. "We'll contest this immediately." My mother's reaction was more physical. She swayed slightly in her chair, her perfectly composed facade crumbling as she pressed a manicured hand to her chest. "I feel faint," she whispered, though her eyes remained sharp and focused. Max's response was the most volatile. He shoved back from the table with such force that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor. "This is a sick joke," he spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Franklin. "You manipulated an old man, turned him against his family. What did you promise my sister for her to go along with this scheme?" Franklin remained utterly composed, reminding me of a seasoned ship captain in a violent storm. "Mr. Morrison, I understand this is upsetting, but I assure you, your father was of completely sound mind when he executed this will. In fact, anticipating this reaction, he took extraordinary measures to document his competency." With a nod to his assistant, Franklin distributed additional documents. "These are the results of 3 separate cognitive and psychological evaluations performed by independent experts over the 6 months preceding the execution of this will. Each conclusively confirms Harold's complete mental competency." He turned to the still recording cameras. "Additionally, as you can all see, These proceedings are being recorded at Harold's explicit instruction, specifically to address any potential challenges to his testamentary capacity. 51%? My father's voice had taken on a dangerous quietness. My father left me, his only son and successor for 30 years, a minority share in my own company. Your ownership share remains at 25%. Mr. Morrison, Franklin clarified. The remaining shares are distributed among other family members as previously established, with Abigail's 51% representing the consolidation of Harold's personal holdings. Aunt Eleanor, always the most level-headed of the siblings, leaned forward. Franklin, while we all respect my brother's right to distribute his assets as he saw fit, you must understand our concern. Abigail has no experience in business. She's never shown any interest in the company. How could she possibly lead Morrison Enterprises? Before Franklin could respond, I found my voice. I didn't ask for this, I said quietly, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. I didn't expect it, and I certainly didn't manipulate Grandpa Harold for it. My mother gave a derisive laugh. Oh, please. Those monthly lunches. The dutiful granddaughter act, you played the long game beautifully. That's not true, I replied, feeling a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I loved him for who he was, not what he could give me. Can all of you say the same? The uncomfortable shifting around the table was answer enough. My cousin Stephanie, always calculating angles, was the first to pivot. Well, family is family, she said with a sudden warmth that had never been directed at me before. We should all support Abigail in this transition. I'm sure she'll want experienced advisors. Absolutely, Bradley chimed in. In fact, I'd be happy to walk you through the Asia-Pacific expansion strategy I've been developing. It would be perfect for your first major initiative as controlling shareholder. Max had recovered enough to adopt a new approach. He righted his chair and sat down, straightening his tie. Abby, he said, using the childhood nickname he'd abandoned years ago, this is overwhelming, I know. But let's be reasonable. You've built a life that's meaningful to you. You don't want the burden of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Why not sell your shares to the family? You'd never have to work again, could fund any charitable causes you care about. I looked at my brother's suddenly solicitous expression and felt a clarity I'd never experienced before. Is that what Grandpa Harold built means to you? Something to cash out when convenient? Franklin cleared his throat. If I may, there are stipulations regarding any potential sale of shares. Ms. Morrison cannot sell her controlling interest for a minimum of 5 years, and even then, only to individuals approved by the secondary trustee, myself. The facade of family unity crumbled instantly. This is absurd, my father hissed. You've engineered a hostile takeover of our family company using my father's sentimentality toward his wayward granddaughter. Richard, Franklin said with steel in his voice. Your father spent the last decade increasingly concerned about the direction you and Maxwell were taking the company. The emphasis on short-term profits over sustainable growth. The repeated attempts to dismantle the employee profit-sharing program he established. The aggressive tax avoidance strategies that skirt ethical boundaries. These were all deeply troubling to him. My father's face went from red to white. Those discussions were private board matters. Yes, and Harold was chairman of that board until his retirement. Nothing you discussed escaped his attention, Franklin replied. Now, shall we continue with the video message? Harold has specific instructions for the transition period. As the video resumed, I watched my family members with new eyes. Behind their shock and anger, I could see calculations happening, alliances forming and dissolving, strategies developing. My mother had moved from dramatic distress to intense focus, whispering urgently to my father. Cousins who had barely acknowledged me for years were now attempting to catch my eye with tentative smiles. The remainder of my grandfather's message outlined a thoughtful transition plan. I would work closely with Franklin and a team of trusted advisors for the first year. Key decisions would require dual approval during this period. Harold had even arranged for me to attend an executive business program if I chose to. When the recording ended, the room erupted into controlled chaos, voices overlapping with questions, objections, and sudden offers of support. Franklin efficiently wrapped up the formal proceedings, promising detailed documentation would be provided to all parties. As people began gathering their belongings, my father approached me, my mother and Max flanking him like sentries. "We need to discuss this privately," he said in the tone that had always brooked no argument. "Family dinner tonight. We'll sort this out reasonably." I looked at the three people who had systematically diminished me for years, who had made me feel worthless for choosing a different path, who had mocked my career dedicated to helping others. "I'm afraid I have plans tonight," I said calmly. "I'm having dinner with Franklin to discuss the transition, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities to talk in the coming weeks." For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in my father's eyes. "Abigail, be sensible. You don't want to make an enemy of your family." I smiled sadly. I never wanted that. But I'm not the one who created the division. "I'll see you soon, Dad." As I turned to leave, I felt lighter somehow, as if the years of seeking approval from people incapable of giving it had been a weight I didn't know I was carrying. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and I had no illusions that they would be enormous, I would face them with the same integrity that had made my grandfather proud. 1 month after the will reading, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was now my office on the 40th floor of Morrison Tower, watching early summer rain pattern the glass. The former CEO's suite had been transformed, the imposing mahogany desk replaced with something more modern and approachable. The dark leather and hunting prints exchanged for comfortable seating and local artwork, including pieces from community programs I'd worked with. The past 4 weeks had been a crash course in corporate leadership unlike anything I could have imagined. Franklin had been my steadfast guide, patiently explaining complex financial structures, introducing key executives, and helping me navigate the treacherous waters of family politics. "Your grandfather always said business isn't complicated," Franklin had told me during our first strategy session. "People make it complicated. Understand the people, and you'll understand the business." That insight had become my North Star. While I lacked my father's financial acumen or Max's aggressive deal-making instincts, I brought something different to Morrison Enterprises, a genuine interest in the human element of business. My first week had been spent not in boardrooms, but visiting company facilities, meeting employees at all levels, asking questions, and, more importantly, listening to the answers. I toured manufacturing plants, distribution centers, and back offices, introducing myself not as the new controlling shareholder, but as someone eager to understand their experience. "You don't have to personally shake hands with every employee in the company," my father had said dismissively when he learned of my approach. Since the will reading, he had adopted a cool, professional demeanor, attending required meetings with clipped efficiency while making his disapproval clear. "Actually, I think I do," I had replied. "At least as many as possible." These people are Morrison Enterprises, not just the family name on the letterhead. Relations with my immediate family remained strained but functional. My mother had made several overtures involving charity galas and social events to properly introduce you to important circles, but I had politely declined, focusing instead on learning the business. Max had been the most surprising. After his initial anger, he had retreated into calculated cooperation, offering insights into ongoing projects with an almost professorial detachment. I remained wary but appreciated his institutional knowledge. My new home, Grandpa Harold's estate where I'd spent so many happy childhood hours, still felt surreal. I had kept most of the rooms as they were, a museum to my grandfather's life, while slowly making the private spaces my own. Each night I would sit in his library, surrounded by the books we had discussed over the years, and write in a journal about the day's challenges and decisions. A soft knock on the office door interrupted my thoughts. My assistant Caroline, the one executive staff member I had personally hired rather than inherited, entered with a leather portfolio. "The files you requested from the archives, Abigail," she said, placing them on my desk. "And Franklin called to confirm your meeting at 3. "Thank you, Caroline." After she left, I opened the portfolio with reverence. Inside were my grandfather's private letters and journals spanning the last 5 years of his life, documents Franklin had safeguarded until I felt ready to read them. The first letter was addressed simply, "To Abigail, when you're ready." My dear Abby, if you're reading this, then you've accepted the responsibility I've placed on your shoulders. I know it wasn't what you expected or perhaps even wanted, but I hope you'll come to understand my reasoning. Business is ultimately about values expressed through action. The Morrison name has opened doors for our family for generations, but with that privilege comes responsibility. I've watched with growing concern as the company culture shifted under your father and brother's leadership, success measured purely by profit margins. People viewed as assets rather than partners in our enterprise. You may wonder why I didn't simply sell the company or step in more forcefully while alive. The truth is complex. I built this company from nothing with your grandmother's unwavering support. Every employee, every contract, every expansion was personal to me. The thought of seeing it dismantled or absorbed into some faceless conglomerate was unbearable. As for confronting Richard and Max directly, there are complicated dynamics between fathers and sons that perhaps you'll be spared as you take the helm. I tried in my way, but found myself repeatedly compromising to maintain peace. It is one of my regrets. What I recognized in you, Abigail, is not just compassion, but clarity. You see people for who they are, not what they can provide. You understand that true value isn't measured in fiscal quarters or stock prices, but in sustainable impact and human dignity. Your background in social work isn't a liability. It's precisely what Morrison Enterprises needs. You know how to listen, how to identify systemic problems, how to build trust with people from all walks of life. These are leadership qualities money can't buy and business schools rarely teach. There are difficult days ahead. Your family may never fully accept your leadership. Board members will question your experience. Competitors will attempt to exploit what they perceive as weakness. Stand firm in your values while remaining open to learning. In my desk drawer, you'll find detailed notes on key executives who can be trusted, who may resist change, who has potential beyond their current role. Trust Franklin implicitly. He has been my moral compass when I've struggled to find my own. Remember that you don't need to be perfect, only authentic. Make decisions you can explain and defend, not just in boardrooms, but in your own heart. The company doesn't need another Richard or Maxwell. It needs Abigail. I am proud of you beyond words. And I believe in you without reservation. With all my love, Grandpa Harold. Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. I had felt so overwhelmed, so inadequate to the task before me. These words were exactly what I needed, not just affirmation, but guidance rooted in deep understanding of both the business and myself. The remaining documents provided unexpected insights into family history. I learned that my father had pushed for aggressive expansion that Harold had consistently tempered. I discovered that Max had proposed several ethically questionable ventures that would have significantly increased profits while undermining the company's reputation. Most surprisingly, I found that my grandfather had been quietly funding progressive workplace initiatives and community development programs through a separate foundation, believing that business had responsibilities beyond shareholder returns. Armed with this new understanding, I felt a clarity of purpose taking shape. I spent the afternoon reviewing a proposal from our innovation team, a partnership with a promising environmental technology startup that needed capital and distribution infrastructure. When Franklin arrived for our meeting, I had already made my decision. I want to move forward with the Greenscale partnership, I said without preamble. Their water purification technology aligns perfectly with our logistics capabilities, and the potential impact in developing regions is substantial. Franklin studied me carefully. It's a departure from our traditional investment profile. The ROI timeline is longer than your father would typically approve. But the long-term benefits, both financial and social, are significant, I countered. This is exactly the kind of initiative that bridges profit and purpose. A smile spread across Franklin's face. Harold would have said the same thing. He had his eye on similar technologies before his health declined. There's something else, I added. I want to reinstate and expand the employee profit-sharing program my father has been systematically reducing. And I'm establishing an education fund for employees' children. The board will have questions about the impact on quarterly earnings, Franklin warned, though I could see approval in his eyes. Then we'll need to help them take a longer view, I replied. Morrison Enterprises has always been built for endurance, not just quarterly sprints. As we worked through implementation details, my office door burst open without warning. My father stood in the doorway, radiating controlled fury, with Max close behind. You authorized a full strategic review of the Pacific Rim operations without consulting me, he demanded. I maintained my composure, grateful for Franklin's steady presence. Good afternoon, Dad. Yes, I did. The preliminary reports show concerning labor practices at several of our manufacturing partners. Those arrangements were carefully negotiated to maintain competitive pricing. My father said dismissively. They were negotiated to cut costs at the expense of safe working conditions, I corrected. That's not how we'll do business going forward. This is exactly why Harold's decision was catastrophically misguided, my father said, his voice dangerously quiet. You're going to dismantle 30 years of strategic positioning because of some bleeding heart idealism. I stood, surprising myself with my steadiness. I'm going to enhance our strategic positioning by ensuring Morrison Enterprises is known for ethical practices and sustainable growth. The world is changing, Dad. Companies that exploit people and resources won't survive the next 30 years. Max stepped forward. Abby, be reasonable. These decisions affect thousands of jobs, including everyone in this building. You can't risk the company's financial health on social experiments. I'm not experimenting, Max. I'm investing in our future. I gestured to the chairs across from my desk. If you'd like to discuss specific concerns about the strategic review, I'm happy to listen. But the review will continue. For a moment. I thought my father might refuse, might storm out as he had from our last contentious meeting. Instead, he assessed me with new eyes. Perhaps seeing for the first time not his disappointing daughter, but a determined CEO. Fine, he said curtly, taking a seat. Let's discuss exactly what you think you found in our Pacific operations. It wasn't acceptance or approval. Those might never come, but it was acknowledgement. For now, that was enough. As the meeting proceeded, tense but productive, I caught Franklin watching me with quiet pride. Something had shifted, not just in my family's perception of me, but in my perception of myself. I wasn't just filling my grandfather's shoes, I was charting my own course, one that honored his values while embracing my own vision. The transformation had begun. 6 months after inheriting control of Morrison Enterprises, I stood on the podium at the company's annual charity gala, surveying the elegantly dressed crowd. The event had been transformed from the self-congratulatory affair of previous years to a genuine celebration of community partnership, with representatives from local organizations mingling with executives and investors. My first major initiative, the Morrison Community Impact Fund, had just announced its inaugural grants to 20 grassroots organizations working on issues from affordable housing to educational access. The fund represented 5% of company profits, a percentage that had prompted heated board discussions, but ultimately passed with surprising support. Quite a different atmosphere from last year. A familiar voice commented as I stepped down from the stage. Franklin Pierce, dapper in his tuxedo, offered me a glass of sparkling water. Is it that obvious? I asked, smiling. Only to those of us who remember the previous versions, he replied. Your grandfather would have loved this approach. Impact with dignity rather than charity with condescension. Across the room, I spotted my father deep in conversation with the mayor. Our relationship had evolved into something I wouldn't call warm, but was at least functional. After months of resistance, he had grudgingly acknowledged some of my initiatives were yielding positive results, both for communities and, more importantly to him, the company's reputation and bottom line. My mother had adapted in her own way, seamlessly incorporating my new status into her social narrative. My daughter has always had such vision. I'd overheard her telling the wife of a prominent investor, conveniently forgetting years of criticism. I maintained polite boundaries while recognizing her behavior as the only form of acceptance she knew how to offer. Max had surprised me most. After several months of tension, he had requested a private meeting and laid out a remarkably thoughtful proposal for sustainable supply chain management, an area I knew had never interested him before. "I've been doing some research," he'd said almost sheepishly. "If we're committed to this new direction, we might as well do it thoroughly." Though I harbored no illusions about his sudden conversion to corporate responsibility, I appreciated the effort to find common ground. The company itself was thriving under the new approach. Our stock had initially dipped when I announced increased investments in employee benefits and environmental upgrades, but had rebounded strongly as consumers and investors responded positively to our transparent practices. The Greenscale partnership had exceeded expectations, attracting attention from international development organizations and opening new markets. Most meaningfully, I had maintained my connections to my former life. Though I could no longer work directly with clients at the community center, I volunteered monthly and had established a professional development program for social workers throughout the city. My old colleagues had been wary at first, concerned I had abandoned our shared values for corporate power, but had gradually recognized I was attempting to bridge two worlds that rarely intersected. After fulfilling my hosting duties at the gala, I slipped away early, driving myself to the small cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The night was clear and cold, stars visible despite the city lights. I made my way to the family plot, where a simple granite headstone marked Harold's final resting place, modest compared to the ornate Morrison mausoleum nearby, but chosen specifically in his final plans. "Hi, Grandpa," I said softly, placing a yellow rose against the stone. "Sorry I've been away so long. It's been a busy few months." In the quiet darkness, I told him everything, the challenges and victories, the difficult decisions and unexpected alliances, the moments of doubt and clarity. Though I had initially resented the burden he'd placed on my shoulders, I had come to understand it as his final act of love, not just for me, but for the legacy he had built and the values he hoped would endure. "The board approved the employee healthcare expansion today," I said. "The one Dad has blocked for 3 years. Even he voted for it in the end, though I think that was more about optics than conviction." A gentle breeze rustled the trees overhead, and I smiled at the familiar feeling of being listened to without judgment. "I found your letters to Grandma Eleanor," I continued. "The ones you wrote every anniversary until the end. I never knew you were such a poet." I paused, emotion catching in my throat. "I understand now why you left me the recording of the will reading. You knew they would challenge it, try to paint you as confused or manipulated. You were protecting me one last time." The video had indeed proven invaluable when a group of minor shareholders, encouraged by distant relatives, had attempted to contest the will. Their case had collapsed almost immediately when their lawyers viewed the recording of Harold's clear, articulate explanation of his decisions and the extensive documentation of his mental competence. "I'm trying to honor what you built without being bound by how it's always been done," I said. "It's a difficult balance. Sometimes I still feel like I'm play-acting at being a CEO, waiting for everyone to realize I'm out of my depth. Other days, I feel like I was preparing for this role my entire life without knowing it. The skills I developed as a social worker, deep listening, systems thinking, conflict resolution, identifying underlying needs, had proven surprisingly transferable to corporate leadership. My experience working with diverse communities had given me insights into markets and consumers that my MBA-trained colleagues sometimes missed. The family is adjusting," I continued. Christmas was tense but civil. "Aunt Eleanor has become an unexpected ally." She confided that she always thought Dad and Max were taking the company in the wrong direction, but never felt she had the standing to challenge them. "We have lunch monthly now, just like you and I used to do." I sat in companionable silence for a while, watching my breath form clouds in the cold air. "I've kept your office at home exactly as it was," I said finally. "Sometimes when I have a particularly difficult decision, I sit at your desk and try to channel your wisdom. Usually, the answer becomes clear. Not what would Grandpa Harold do, but what would he want me to have the courage to do?" As I stood to leave, I placed my hand on the cold granite. Thank you for believing I could do this. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. I promise to steward what you built with integrity, to measure success by more than profit margins, and to remember that the Morrison legacy is about impact, not just influence. The drive back to what was now my home felt like crossing a threshold between past and future. The grand house that had once intimidated me as a child now represented not just privilege but possibility, the opportunity to direct resources toward meaningful change. In the months since the will reading, I had gradually reorganized my understanding of family. Blood relationships remained complicated, perhaps irreparably damaged in some cases. But I had discovered family in unexpected places, in Franklin's mentorship, in the loyal employees who had welcomed my leadership, in the communities who had cautiously accepted my overtures as genuine. I realized that my grandfather's final gift wasn't just the material inheritance, substantial as it was. It was the confidence to stand firmly in my own values even when they contradicted prevailing wisdom. It was permission to redefine success on my own terms. It was validation that compassion and business acumen weren't mutually exclusive, but potentially complementary strengths. The journey ahead would continue to be challenging. There would be resistance to change, skepticism about my qualifications, and the constant pressure to prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. There would be days when I questioned my grandfather's judgment in placing such responsibility in my hands. But as I pulled into the driveway of the Morrison estate, my home now, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for much of my life. Not because I had finally gained my family's approval, but because I no longer needed it to recognize my own worth. The black sheep had become the shepherd, not by changing her nature, but by remaining true to it when it would have been easier to conform. The outsider had found purpose precisely because she could see what those too comfortable on the inside had missed. The humiliation at the will reading had transformed into a platform for creating the change I had always worked toward, just on a scale I never imagined possible. As I walked up the steps to the grand entrance, I paused to look up at the stars once more. Feeling the weight of the Morrison legacy not as a burden, but as an opportunity to break cycles of toxicity and create something more meaningful than mere wealth accumulation. I won't waste this chance, Grandpa, I whispered to the night sky. I promise. What would you do if you suddenly inherited responsibility you never expected? Would you have the courage to chart your own course, even if it meant facing criticism from those closest to you? I hope my story has shown that sometimes our greatest strengths come from the very qualities others have dismissed. If you found something meaningful in my journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of unexpected transformations. Share this video with someone who might need reassurance that being different isn't a weakness, it might just be their superpower in disguise. Thank you for listening, and remember, true inheritance isn't just what's written in a will, but the values we choose to carry forward.